am an entomologist, and that means on first dates, I am always asked what my favourite type of insect is. And I believe in laying all my red flags out on the table. So I like to tell them that I really love this type of wasp that lays its babies inside another insect, and then those babies eat it alive from the inside out. It goes down well. I get bitches. And you guys have all actually paid to get the same experience my dates do, where I tell them for 20 minutes straight how fucking awesome parasitoid wasps are. So, without further ado, what is a parasitoid wasp? I'm glad you asked. A parasitoid wasp is a type of insect that requires another organism for their development, and it has to be at the host's expense. So, essentially, think the chest-bursting scene from Aliens. And yes, this movie was actually inspired by the life cycle of parasitoid wasps. So when I talk about parasitoid wasps, people tend to cringe. Weird, right? And I think in part it's because they are thinking of European wasps. But sort of just to drive the point home, they are completely different things. There's a little size comparison up the top there, thankfully not to scale. But you can see they're very different. And parasitoid wasps are actually an incredibly diverse group of insects. In some of the most common families, like the ichneumons, there is around 100,000 species. In the Braconidae, there's around 50,000 species. And then in the chalcids, there is a staggering 500,000 species estimated. And the really insane part here is that most of them are still undescribed, meaning that we've only scientifically validated and named around 70,000 species. In these species, it ranges from the teeny tiny little fairy flies. Yes, that's what they're really called. It's very wholesome. And they are so small that you can't see them with the naked eye. And then there are the really intimidating, scary spider parasitoids. And honestly, I think they're kind of cute, right? Like, you know, they've got these tiny little round faces, these big puppy dog eyes. No? Is it just me? All right, you guys are going to love the rest of the talk then. So a little bit about their biology. The females have what we call an ovipositor. And this is what they use to inject their eggs onto or inside of their hosts. Now, only the females will do this. The men are useless. Typical. Some species have actually evolved to be able to reproduce without males, so feminism win. So, whilst this ovipositor is a modified stinger and they may paralyze their host, the majority don't sting humans. The majority. There are some exceptions, like the tarantula hawk wasp. Yes, you heard that right. So this insect actually has one of the most painful stings on the planet. It has been described as instantaneous, electrifying, and totally debilitating. And one may only lay down and scream. Which, ironically enough, is also how my first dates have been described. So, like I said, the females will lay their eggs on or inside the hosts, and this essentially turns it into a walking pantry. I bet you guys thought you had a helicopter parent, right? So, the eggs will hatch, the larvae will feed on the insect whilst it's still alive as they develop, and then they will mature. So, they'll spin these little cocoons and they'll turn into the adult wasp, kind of like a really fucked up butterfly. And then they will emerge from the host and the host will die. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it does. So parasitoid wasps can actually alter their host's development and behaviour. A really good example of this is the spider parasitoids. They can actually make the spiders weave an entirely different type of web in order to support their cocoons. They can stop the development in order to give the babies longer time inside their hosts, or they can chemically hijack and disable the immune system of their host. And that's important if they're an internal parasitoid, because that means they don't have to compete against the host's immune system. And a really cool, gruesome example of this is the Glyptopentales wasp. So in this example, a single female will lay around 80 eggs within one caterpillar host. And then when the time is right, the babies will chew through the caterpillar's skin, they'll spin their cocoons and turn into the adults. But the real kicker is that one or two of these larvae won't actually go through this maturity process. They will stay inside the caterpillar, and we don't quite know how they do this, but they turn it into a zombie bodyguard. So that is the video you see there. The caterpillar will stay by these pupating wasps, and if it detects movement, say of an insect that might want to eat these tasty little morsels, it will then start like thrashing its head wildly to scare it off. So, its last act of life is actually to defend the very insects that turned it into a living buffet. And now you can see why parasitoid wasps were sufficiently horrid enough to convince Charles Darwin that God did not exist. So in a letter to his bestie, he wrote, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars." Now, this is kind of an intense stance to take, and we entomologists, we kind of took it personally. And the thing to know about entomologists is that we are kind of a petty bunch. So we now call the Ichneumonidae Darwin's wasps. Like, take that, Darwin! So despite Darwin's dislike of them, parasitoids actually have some really cool evolutionary adaptations. So host location is a very complex process. It's basically like a super high stakes game of hide and seek. They actually have to go through a whole process of host location and examination behaviours. They have to be attracted to their host, they have to make contact, they have to then go through a whole bunch of examination and acceptance behaviours. So, they've got like high standards, which is good for them. Can't relate. And then this pre-contact stage is actually one of the most important and difficult parts of it. So because they're often finding like super well hidden hosts, very inconspicuous, they've had to develop like some really serious Sherlock level detective skills. So they use very specialized cues in order to identify their hosts. These can be visual, they can be the smell, they can even be like the vibrations that the insects will give off. And the really cool thing here is that there are two different ways in which parasitoids do it. There is associative and non-associative. So, non-associative. These cues are basically signals that the wasp is instinctively attracted to from birth. So, a really good example of this is a wasp called Mastrus ridens. That's that little guy up the top there, and I actually worked with them last year. I released 10,000 of them into a Tasmanian apple orchard, and I love saying that because it makes me sound like a supervillain. But I was doing it for a good cause, I promise. We were actually doing it because they are a parasitoid of codling moth. And this is like your very typical worm in an apple, but they can actually wipe out an entire season's worth of apples if they are left unchecked. So codling moth, when they spin their cocoons to turn into the adult moth, they release an aggregation pheromone. And this is basically saying to all the other codling moths in the area, like, hey, conditions are kind of great right now. You want to come over? We can pupate together. But Mastrus ridens is a little bit of a party crasher. So it will actually use 11 compounds from 4 classes of organic chemicals in very, very specific ratios that are found only in this aggregation pheromone to find and accept the codling moth as their host. And this is really important because only small changes are required within this pheromone before they are no longer able to identify and accept it as their host, and they're left wondering where the fuck the party is at. And this is really important because, first of all, it means that the wasp isn't laying their eggs in hosts that aren't viable. And it also means that when we're releasing 10,000 of them into an orchard like a supervillain, that we know they're not going to attack anything else. So, it's not going to be like another cane toad situation. And this, I think, is just about the coolest thing in the world. So, parasitoid wasps can actually learn. They can learn to associate environmental cues with their hosts during the process of ovipositioning. And this sort of learning process streamlines their foraging strategies and makes them more efficient predators and parasitoids. So in nature, typically this association would involve like the recognition of plant odors where their host is feeding. But the super cool thing is that it is a remarkably adaptive capacity. So the little wasp up the corner there called Micropletus, it has actually demonstrated the ability to associate the novel cues of chocolate and vanilla with their hosts. So it's got a bit of a sweet tooth. But this is really cool because these are scents that they would never come across in their natural environment. So like it's an insane sort of really smart ability. And I think this part is really cool because this is like this insect that on first glance is so foreign to us that it inspires horror movies and it convinces a man that God doesn't exist. But like it's not that dissimilar to us. It is learning about its environment constantly. It is using problem solving and perception. And I just think that is a really amazing phenomenon in nature. All right, so if you're not like me and you don't think that's cool, you might be wondering why you should care beyond the nightmares that I might have given you. But the thing is that all of these biological factors that we've just discussed, so their efficiency, their host specificity, and the direct impact they have on their hosts, means that they are really useful to us in agriculture. So like when I was releasing the wasps to help the apple orchards out. And because there is such a rich behavioural diversity among all of these parasitoid wasps, it means that there is a really rich ecological system that we can rely on. There's basically a parasitoid that controls just about every pest you could think of. And we have to admit that we have kind of screwed up our agricultural systems a little bit. And I think that is perfectly encapsulated by this quote from Silent Spring. So Silent Spring is a book about DDT. And if you're not familiar with DDT, it is this super nasty chemical that we first used in warfare. And we looked at it and we went, if we put that on our food, I reckon it would keep the insects away. Don't think there'd be any sort of unforeseen consequences there. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you beyond the fact that there were some unintended consequences. And this is really obvious in this other study that I also did last year. So that little guy down the bottom there is called Australis. He is another type of fairy fly, like I mentioned earlier. And he is a parasitoid of, so you guys here call them apple leaf hoppers, but in Tassie we call them canary flies because they're yellow. I know. But basically canary fly is another really economically damaging pest of apples, and they're actually so annoying that they count as a work health and safety hazard, which same. So I counted a shitload of these guys across the period of November to March last year. And what we saw was that initially the numbers tracked really closely in a very classic predator-prey relationship. But then in this December to January period, the numbers dropped right off. Then in February to March, the canary fly numbers were able to recover and they shot right back up. But the fairy fly just never recovered. To give you guys some context, I counted something like 25, 30,000 canary fly, but only 5,000 Anagrus amatus. So really big difference there. And I'm going to ask you guys a question, so someone better answer me. But what do we think might have happened in this December to January period? No? Yep, exactly. When we looked at the spraying schedule for this farm, this was exactly when they were spraying to control moths in the orchard. So this is actually what we call a secondary pest incursion, which is where we spray for one pest and then another pest comes in and takes its place. Because by removing the complexities within our agricultural system, we actually made the perfect environment for the other pest. In this case, we got rid of the natural control of the parasitoid. And the really tricky thing here is that parasitoids can never cope with pesticides as well as what pests can. They're so small that their biology is just really sensitive to it. And we're basically removing a really key part of their life cycle. So they are never going to be able to recover as well. But luckily, we are sort of starting to learn our lessons. So there are some ways in which we can put this resilience and this complexity back into our agricultural systems. So one way we do this is biological control, and there are a couple of different methods. So there is classical control, which is where we reintroduce natural enemies with the primary goal of re-establishing a long-term self-sustaining population in order to sort of re-establish top-down control. If these natural enemies aren't able to establish within our systems, we can do augmentative control, which is where we do continual re-releases to try and bolster their populations. A really good example of this is Micropletus. So this is the same guy who likes chocolate and vanilla. And they are a parasitoid of Helicoverpa, which is a very common caterpillar pest of our broadacre crops. So like your oats, your canola, your wheat. And it also spreads ascovirus, which is a lethal caterpillar virus. So together, these two factors can actually keep the populations under the economic threshold, which is the point in which a farmer will look at his crop and say, I've got too many pests. If I don't do something now, I'm going to suffer economic losses. So they can actually reduce the population by over 75%. And by doing this, we are saving a lot of money because we don't have to spray, and we're also protecting the environment. And the cool thing is that you can buy these wasps online. So if you ever have any caterpillars in your own garden, or you want to send like 10,000 wasps to your ex, you can do that. Hit him up. Yeah, some broken hearts in the room tonight. Oops. And this is generally complemented by conservation control, which is, it has two main principles, which is do no harm and enhance biodiversity, which I just think are sort of lovely principles to live by in general. But it's basically the practices of supporting natural enemies through practices such as like spraying less pesticides and planting floral resources, so flowers. And by doing this, we actually intensify the predation pressure in our systems because we are supporting and maintaining them. And planting flowers in particular is actually really important through a principle that we call SNAP. So you can remember that next time you go to Bunnings. So it's basically, it provides shelter for overwintering and protection against the elements and other predators. It provides nectar as a vital carbohydrate fuel source. Think like when you're really sad and you eat a lot of pasta. It gives them alternative prey to sustain beneficial populations. So when the pest isn't in the crop, it gives them somewhere else to complete their life cycle. And then it provides pollen to provide the essential protein for eggs. So it's a long-term investment, and we're also looking after the next generation. And I reckon that is just about my time, but I just want to leave you with the final thought that a biodiverse invertebrate community, it not only makes our agriculture stronger, but I think by sort of acknowledging and appreciating the inherent worth of these really cool, amazing, freaky, gruesome little insects, it makes us better people too. Thank you.
All right, what a great talk. I don't think I've ever thought about parasitoid wasps before.
Now you
but
think about them a lot.
Yeah, now I think I'll think about them a lot. I'm sure there's so many questions in the audience. I think put your hand up if you've got a question. Yep, right down the front here. What type of flowers should you plant?
Parasitoids generally like Elysium a lot, actually. They like yarrow, anything that is sort of small and sort of compounded, even like native carrots, they really like. Grass is also surprisingly good for parasitoids because it offers a lot of pollen.
Another question. I saw some hands up. Yep, go here. So how can we make sure the parasitoids are not grabbing the bees as their host?
Yeah, like I said, they are super host specific. So I don't actually think there are many bee parasitoids in particular, just because bees are quite a large insect and they're also part of the same Hymenopteran family. Not to say that they don't parasitize each other. There are actually parasitoids that will parasitize parasitoids. But generally, I think like the European honeybee are quite safe in Australia.
We, of course, have to save the bees.
Yes.
I saw some more hands going up. We'll go over this side, down the front here.
You know what? It was actually really disappointing. I put out a bunch of like sentinels, which are basically where we throw cardboard with codling moth in them to try and track what they're doing. But all the codling moth escaped, which I can't really blame them. If like something was going to parasitize me, I guess I'd run away as well. But I guess I hope that they did the right thing. And it's a super long story, but actually the parasitoid Mastus ridens is really inbred, which I guess is why they were in Tassie.
Hopefully there's no people from Tasmania here that would get offended by that. Is there any questions at the back? I can't quite see a lot of hands at the back. Yes, we'll go over here. How do we count these parasitoid wasps?
Oh, taxonomists are fucking insane, man. I'm not in taxonomy because it goes over my head because they do maths. But I assume they have some sort of formulae or something. I just think they're cool.
Yep, right down the front.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is there any resistance by the host?
Yeah, so certain insects will have like strategies against it. So like with the codling moth and their aggregation pheromone, it is a like safety in numbers thing. Like, you know, we're all hanging out, they can't parasitize all of us sort of deal. There's also like certain caterpillars that are super hairy, which acts as a little bit of a deterrent to them as well. So it is one of those sort of like evolutionary arm races.
Maybe like make a sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there any? Yep, got one right over in the corner there.
Wow, you guys are eager.
Oh, always. That's a great question. If they're not killing the host,
yeah, that is actually a really good question. So with certain insects like the caterpillars, we really want to encourage the egg parasitoids because they get to them before they get to the damaging stage. With certain insects as well, they are most damaging at particular times of the crop. So like Helicoverpa, for example, they are the most damaging when they get to like quite a large stage because that's when they can sort of get into the pods. So we want the insects that can parasitize them before they reach that stage. And then with other insects like green peach aphid, for example, which are a major pest of canola, they are generally worse in the early season. So you want something that comes and gets them very, very quickly. But yeah, it is also one of those things where we're trying to get farmers to think long term and say, well, the crops can sustain a little bit of damage actually. Like you don't need to spray the shit out of everything. So it's sort of one of those just hold your nerve a little bit.
Interesting. I think we have time for maybe 2 quick questions. So we've got one right here, very eager question. Are all parasitoids vegetarian?
Actually, yeah,
maybe vegan.
Yeah, most of the adult parasitoids will only eat pollen and nectar. So they don't actually attack anyone else besides for laying their babies in them, which good for them.
So gross when you put it like that. Okay, one last question. You can choose between you. One of you choose. How did you release them?
Yeah, can I flip back?
Of course.
Ooh. I like there we go. So yeah, basically what happened was that we had these little cardboard rolls, and I don't know how clear it is for you guys, but you can sort of see the little white spots, and in each of those white spots is a codling moth. And what we did is there was like an adult, and then they would lay their eggs into these white spots, which is the codling moth. And then we would rear them out in a little bug dorm, which sounds very wholesome and like collegey. And then once like 25% of the wasps had emerged from these little cardboard rolls, we went, all right, time to go off into the world. And we hung them up in these cages, which are actually fruit fly cages. We cut some holes in them and then we hung them up and we said, go be free, go parasitize things. Free Willy.
I love that. All right, we'll let Lilia off the hook, but she will be here all night. So please ask her all of your questions.
Come talk to me.
That there was still lots of hands up, so there's lots of interest in your talk.
I love it.
But
I've had 3 whiskeys.
Slay. All right.
Yes.
All right, well, thank Lilia for her amazing talk.